gather, fellowship together with other believers, look at your word and see what you have for us. Pray for those down the hall working with the younger kids and the teens, that you'd bless this time, and pray for Pastor as he brings the message later. In Jesus' name, amen. So we'll be in John chapter 21, which is kind of broken into two sections: Jesus appearing to 7 disciples, and then Jesus dealing more on an individual level with Peter and to some extent the beloved disciple. And so in some ways, chapter 21 structure mirrors the last half of chapter 20. In the last week, in looking at the last half of chapter 20, we saw in chapter 20 Jesus appearing to a group of disciples. Then the focus shifts to him appearing again to a group of disciples, but the focus is there on him and an individual disciple, in that case Thomas. And then Thomas is challenged to no longer be unbelieving, but be believing in the risen Christ that he was hesitant to believe in. And then chapter 20 ends with kind of the purpose verse of the Gospel of John, with then, after Thomas's personal declaration of my Lord and my God, the author, John most likely, the apostle, calls the reader to make a personal decision of faith and challenges that these are written that you might believe, and that through believing you might have eternal life. So in chapter 20, it kind of has a structure of Jesus meeting with a group of disciples, encouraging them in believing in the risen Christ, then to an individual who makes an individual statement, and then the purpose of the Gospel of John. And because that purpose of the Gospel of John almost feels like a conclusion, there are some who think that's really where the Gospel of John ends, at chapter 20. And that chapter 21 was a later addition, maybe a different author, and wasn't really supposed to be part of the Gospel of John. There are others, and that I would agree with, who think that chapter 21 was always part of the Gospel of John, and that was written by the same author as the rest of the Gospel of John, most likely John, the apostle, and that it is an epilogue that echoes the conclusion. It is in some ways a parallel. And the structure partially shows that. In chapter 21, it mirrors the end of chapter 20, in that we have Jesus appearing to a group of disciples. Then, even though he's with a group of disciples, the focus shifts to Jesus and an individual disciple, Peter in this case, and then ends with a conclusion that sounds similar to chapter 20, but slightly different. In that with chapter 20, it ends with this call to belief, whereas chapter 21, the emphasis with first the disciples as a group, and then Peter as an individual, and then the narrator to the reader, a call to the disciple or the believer to participate now that they believe. And so because of that, the commentators who think that 21 was always intended to be part of the Gospel of John point out that even though there is this conclusion at the end of chapter 20, that there's kind of a part 2 to that conclusion in 21. The other evidence that 21 was always intended to be part of the book is that there's no manuscripts of John that have been found that don't have chapter 21 as part of it. And so if it wasn't part of it, it would have had to have been added really soon after the writing of John, since some of the manuscripts of John are relatively old. And it fits in with the themes. And even though there's some differences, there are differences because it's a part 2 of the conclusion with a slightly different focus. The other evidence that people point to that chapter 21 is intended and was intended to be part of the book is take chapter 21 off and the entire structure of the book becomes unbalanced. Because the Gospel of John very clearly starts with a prologue, then has, depending on the individuals, we've been breaking it up into two major sections, the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. Other commentators break it into other sections. But pretty much everybody's in agreement that the Gospel of John starts with a prologue. Take the epilogue off and it's unbalanced. Keep the epilogue where it likely belonged all along, and it now balances with the prologue from kind of a literary structure standpoint. So even though there are some who say, well, 21 wasn't intended to be part of the gospel or was a later add-on or wasn't even written by the same author, it's unlikely that that's the case. And so we're going to treat it where I think it belongs, part of the Gospel of John. Oops. And as I said, we kind of have two sections. Jesus appearing to a group of disciples. We're going to see that there's 7 of them in this group. But Jesus appearing to a group of disciples, and then Jesus' focus on an individual disciple, Peter, and then ending with some statements by the narrator, the beloved disciple, John. So the first section I'm going to break into kind of 4 parts, starting with setting the stage in Galilee with fishermen without fish. And then that transitions to an emphasis on those fishermen being disciples who are without Jesus. Now, not without him from the standpoint of they've abandoned him or they're no longer believers or they never were believers. It's more that physically in this setting, they're fishing by themselves without the presence of Jesus physically with them. As we talked about last time, they likely haven't received the promised Holy Spirit yet. And this chapter is additional evidence of that, in that these disciples are not acting the same as they did after Pentecost, where very clearly they were empowered by the Spirit. Then we see kind of the central part of this section. Jesus is recognized by the disciples. And then kind of a conclusion of this section, this being the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples. So let's get into John 21, verses 1 to 3. So after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we are going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. So verses 1 to 3 are kind of setting the scene of this narrative dialogue, in that the disciples, at least 7 of them here, have now left Jerusalem and are in Galilee at the Sea of Tiberias, which would be another name for the Sea of Galilee. So they're back on their home fishing turf, so to speak, at the Sea of Galilee. And there are 7 of them here. Sons of Zebedee would be James and John. So we know John the Apostle is one of the 7 here. Of these 7, there are 2 that are completely unnamed, that we don't know who they are specifically. This chapter is part of the evidence in why it is thought that the other disciple, the beloved disciple, this individual who's played an important part throughout the gospel but who isn't named, is very much likely John the Apostle. We've talked about before that often in a literary setting like this, the author, if he was a character, wouldn't name himself. So that's evidence that the author is the other disciple, the beloved disciple. And by the end of chapter 21, that's made explicitly clear that the other disciple, the beloved disciple, claims to be the author and is the human author that God used to write these words down. But here we have in chapter 21, that other disciple, the beloved disciple, shows up. And since we know that the only individuals involved in this narrative are Jesus and these 7 disciples, the other disciple, the beloved disciple, has to be one of the unnamed in the 7. So that already narrows him down to one of the 2 sons of Zebedee, either John or James, or the 2 unnamed disciples that we have no idea who they are. And it can't be James, because James was martyred before the Gospel of John was written. And so it narrows it down then to 3 individuals it has to be, either the other son of Zebedee, John, or the other 2 unnamed disciples. And there's no good evidence that it would be either of the other 2 unnamed disciples. There's just no reason to think it was them. So even if we don't know for certainty who the author is here, this passage narrows it down to a pool of 3, basically. John, or 2 completely anonymous disciples, who are likely 2 of the other 12, though not necessarily. Because here the 7 disciples are not specifically out of the 12. Nathanael is a disciple, but not one of the 12, and he's listed here as a disciple. So as disciples in this passage is appearing to, it's not specifically the 12. So that just kind of as a side note here, setting the stage. They are at the Sea of Galilee. Now there's some who interpret this as being, well, the disciples have kind of abandoned their apostolic ministry and have decided they're going to completely shirk their duties and go fishing. But that really isn't supported by this passage. It's more likely that, well, just like Paul, when he was doing his apostolic duties, also worked a trade as a sewer, as a tent maker, as somebody who repaired fabric and leather goods. Here, a good group of these disciples, by trade, were fishermen. And so them going fishing is not an indication that they had abandoned their calling as a disciple. It's just that as a disciple, they fulfilled multiple roles, and one of those roles was they needed food to eat. And so they're like, okay, let's go fishing. And here we have Peter, who often is kind of the individual of action. They're at the Sea of Galilee. He's the first one to say, okay, let's go fishing. And the others follow in with him. We do see in this, though, a little bit of an image here, and something that's pointed out is that the emphasis on this passage is not so much why they went fishing, but the results of the fishing. The results of the fishing here, where that night they caught nothing. And so there's a couple things here that likely are intentional to fill out the setting of the scene here, so to speak. One is it's nighttime. And in the Gospel of John, night is never a positive thing. Night is always negative. A picture of the world being in darkness of sin. And so here we have this image in verse 3 of it's night and they caught nothing. So they went fishing, and it's unlikely that they were doing something wrong in going fishing. It's just that they're going fishing, it's night, and they're coming up empty. They've caught nothing. They're going to be hungry in the morning. They've worked hard. They're going to be tired. They're likely going to be cold, and they're going to be hungry, and they have nothing to show for the fishing. And so we have this picture in verse 1 to 3 of fishermen without fish at the Sea of Galilee. Now the reference to Sea of Galilee here, there's some references in Mark that Jesus indicated that he would meet them in Galilee. So there are some who think that, well, the disciples at Jesus' crucifixion were supposed to go to Galilee. And here they are in Galilee. And that's one of the evidences that it's unlikely that here they're abandoning their call of disciples. In fact, it's more likely they're actually being obedient in going to Galilee finally. Whereas initially they were hiding behind locked doors when Jesus initially appeared to them, where they really probably should have been in Galilee where they are now. So they go fishing, but they come up empty. And so in verse 4, we then have a transition here. And so verse 3 ends with, "And that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come." So we have this scene of night, this scene of darkness, where they've come up empty, is now interrupted by the sunrise. Physical light is coming to this setting here. And we have in verse 4, "But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus." And so we have this change in the setting here from these individuals who have been fishing in physical darkness at night, coming up empty of physical food to eat. And we now have, when the morning had now come. So the sun is rising, we have physical light, and immediately after the words, "when the morning had now come," Jesus stood in the bank. So here the author is painting this picture of darkness coming up empty, the fishermen without fish, the disciples without Jesus, and here is the physical light of sunrise and the spiritual light of the world showing up to this scene. Jesus is now standing on the shore. They don't recognize him at this point, but even though at this point, verse 4 says, "Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus," they haven't recognized that the light of the world is there. This to the reader should draw the reader back to the prologue, and specifically chapter 1, verses 4 to 5. "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." So here, even as disciples in this picture here do not understand and do not comprehend that the person on the shore who's about to greet them is the light of the world. Not because they're unbelievers, but just because at this moment in time, in their frustration of the fruitless toils of fishing and coming up empty, they've lost sight of the light momentarily. And so in this chapter, there's kind of these literary pictures to draw the reader to see things. And one of them here is seeing that the light in a dark world is Jesus. And Jesus says to them, "Children, have you any food?" And they answered him, "No." And the wording here is interesting, because this is the first time in the Gospel of John, and no, it's not the first time, but one of the few times in the Gospel of John that Jesus refers to the disciples as children. And that's actually one of the reasons why some people think, well, this wasn't written by John, as the wording here is different. Well, no, it's likely that there's a particular reason that word was chosen here. So at this point, the disciples haven't recognized him, but that doesn't mean they aren't children of God. They are still recognized by the Good Shepherd as being children. And this, again, especially back to back with Jesus pictured as the light in verse 4, should draw the reader's attention back to the prologue, where in verse 12, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name." So Jesus standing on the shore, even though at this moment they are not recognizing him, the Good Shepherd recognizes them as children, and as the Good Shepherd, calls to them and is about to provide for them. And he asked them this question, have you any food? And they answered him, no. And in the Greek, the word for food here is a small morsel or tidbit that often is referred to a small amount of fish. And so here, the disciples are unable to provide food for themselves on their own, even though they're professional fishermen. And yet here, the Good Shepherd, who tends to his flock and feeds his flock, is here at dawn, the breaking of light, to greet them first with his greeting children, a question, do you have any food? And they answer and say, no. And he says to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of the fish. And some have kind of been like, well, why would they do that since they didn't know it was Jesus? They've been fishing. Presumably, they've been trying everywhere with their net. These individuals are not amateurs. This is their home fishing spot. And here this random guy on the shore says, well, cast your net on the right side and you'll get fish. And they do it. Well, again, the emphasis here isn't so much on the why, but the result. The emphasis on the passage isn't why they decided to go fishing, but on their being not successful in catching no fish without Jesus. And now when this individual gives some advice, cast it on the right side of the boat, whether it was just they were tired, whether they just figured they'd humor this guy and show him, no, there's no fish over there anyways, we've already tried there. They do this, and not only do they catch fish, there's so many fish that the 7 of them can't pull this net full of fish into the boat because of the multitude of the fish. And so here we have, on their own, the disciples come up empty fishing. And now, with Jesus' guidance, they come up with fish. Now, we're going to see in a moment, he already has fish and bread that he is already cooking on a fire prepared for them to eat. So why did they need to catch fish? Well, one of the themes in the Gospel of John, and one of the themes especially in chapter 21 here, is that once the individual believes, they are to participate in the ministry. Jesus is here as a good shepherd to provide for his disciples, but he's here also to encourage them to participate in that. So rather than him just telling them, come on over, I've got food provided, he asks them if they have food, and they say no, and he says, okay, cast the net over here, and suddenly their net is full of a multitude of fish. So there's a picture here that's being built both for the disciples at that event, but also for the reader, reinforcing that the believer is to participate. And we're going to see that brought even stronger in the next part of this. And so therefore, in verse 7, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. So here we have Peter and the beloved disciples, so Peter and John. And a little bit of difference in their character here. John has a spiritual insight to immediately recognize this is the Lord, this is Jesus. Peter, on the other hand, is the one who's the individual of action. He immediately does something with this. Now, throughout the Gospel of John, there are some who try to kind of pit this conflict between John and Peter, which is likely unfair to them and is likely not at all the intent of any of the contrast between them. The contrast between them here is starting to set up a contrast, not in a conflict between them, but a difference in their calling. Both of them, as disciples, were called to follow Jesus. Both of them were called to participate in that. But we're going to see that part of the emphasis here is how they are called to participate is going to be different. And it's not that one is better or worse for that. It is that each believer is called, but not every believer is called to do the exact same thing. And here we see that coming out in their response. Both of the responses are good, but the responses are different. And that's okay. Something that I should have added in here also is in verses 4 to 6, as we see the disciples without Jesus, and it references back to the prologue. There's also a reference back to one of Jesus' I am statements that I skipped over. And then it's in John 15:5. Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. That was a truth that Jesus had said to the disciples. And it's a truth that here Jesus is illustrating to the disciples with them spending all night on their own trying to catch fish and coming up empty. And now they follow what he says and they come up with a net full of fish. Now the illustration here shouldn't be taking that the disciples were sinning somehow by fishing on their own. That doesn't seem consistent with the context here. But rather, it's an illustration that Jesus is using the fact that they were fishing and coming up empty as a way to illustrate to them a truth that he had taught them and a truth that they are going to need going forward in following him and doing his ministry, even more so than when they're physically fishing. So verse 7 and 8, we have now Jesus is recognized by the disciples. John, the beloved disciple, has the quick insight, and Peter has the quick action. And so verse 8, but the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging with a net of fish. So it's kind of pointed out here that they were only about 100 yards away from shore when Peter jumped ship and went swimming and running and wading over to shore and leaving them with a net of fish. And so the rest of them don't jump out of the boat. They're like, well, we're pretty close. We should probably bring the boat. And as we're bringing the boat, we can drag in the fish. Because the fact that they couldn't lift it into the boat, there's no way if all of them jump out of the boat and swim in like Peter was, that the fish are going to make it to shore. They're going to lose all these fish that they just caught. And so Peter, in his exuberance, has a good response, but if everybody in the boat responded the same way, they would have lost the catch of fish. So again, it's not that one of them had a right response and the other had a wrong response. It's that they had different response. One leading the charge to the beach, the others bringing in the boat with the catch of fish. As they recognize this is Jesus. So verse 9. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. So they realize that even though they've just caught all these fish, there's already breakfast ready for them. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is already tending to his flock in that he already has prepared fish and bread, that they don't have to clean the fish they just caught and then cook the fish to eat. The fish is ready. They're tired, they're cold, they're weary, they're ready for breakfast, and breakfast is ready for them. But at the same time, they've also been called in to participate in this, and that they've brought even more fish to this. That after they have their first course, they could clean some of these fish and eat some of these fish, presumably. As I said, this passage has the author is intentionally putting together some symbols for the reader to pick up on, as far as them catching nothing at night, and then it being morning and Jesus standing there and them not seeing and understanding the light at first, but then recognizing and responding correctly to him. We also have the fish. By the 2nd century, the Greek ichthyos fish had become a symbol of the resurrection to Christians. And it was not uncommon by the 2nd century for Christian graves to have that fish carved on it as a symbol of the resurrection. And so it's very fitting here that this epilogue, right after Jesus' resurrection, has this imagery of the disciples catching many fish and Jesus providing them with his fish to eat and bread. Another reference to earlier in the Gospel of John, where Jesus said he was the bread of life. We also have them gathering in fellowship around a fire of coals. And so there's also this picture of unity that Jesus emphasized around this fire of coals and sharing of food, which in most cultures, sharing a meal is considered an act of friendship or fellowship. No exception in this culture. In fact, even more so in that culture, sharing a meal would symbolize that, and especially around a fire of coals. But this fire of coals here has a second reference for the reader. The fire of coals showed up in John 18, where Peter, after the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, was warming himself around a fire of coals with some of the temple police who had arrested Jesus. And at that time, Peter, with these individuals around this fire of coals, is asked 3 questions. And he answers incorrectly to all 3 of them, denying Christ 3 times. And so as the first half of 21 kind of wraps up with this image of the disciples, and specifically Peter here, around this fire of coals with the fish and the bread with Jesus, the next section focuses on Peter and 3 questions that Peter is asked. So in verse 10, Jesus says to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught." Again, an emphasis here that the disciples are supposed to participate. They aren't just supposed to take what the Good Shepherd is giving them. They are then to take that and then multiply that and participate in that. And so Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land full of large fish. So again, Peter's the one of action here. He was the first to shore, and now he's the first to grab that net. 153 fish. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Now there are some who've spent a huge amount of time debating what that number 153 meant, and have come up with quite a bit of interesting theories on it that we're not going to go into, because it's likely that all of them are wrong. And all of them, some of them even involve some very, very obscure mathematics called triangular mathematics to come up with the symbolism of them. Or mathematics assigning Greek and Hebrew words numbers in these kind of this secret code. Well, there's symbolism in the Gospel of John, but when there's symbolism, the context shows you that, and it's not hidden secret that you need to do secret calculations with secret triangular math to figure out. And so if there was symbolism intended with the 153, it was so obscure that the author failed in making the meaning clear, and if there's symbolism that the meaning isn't clear, it probably isn't intentional. Rather, it's probably much simpler, the 153, in that they have this large catch a fish that they got after catching nothing that's so big, 7 of them can't pull it into the ship, and they have to drag it onto shore, and the net isn't broken, and they're looking at this catch of fish, and somebody goes, I wonder how many we got. You know, every fishing story, it's either how many you've got or how big they are. Well, here they wanted to make sure that they were accurate in this because this was a fishing story for the records, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't have to embellish the story by making stuff up because there really were 153 fish. Details like this also are sometimes added by an author to emphasize the truth of the eyewitness, specific details. And we're going to see chapter 21 ends with an emphasis on this testimony being true. So it's unlikely that there's some hidden symbolism behind the 153. It's more likely it's just there were 153 fish and somebody counted them, and John, being one of those somebodies, wrote that number down. And the net was not broken. And Jesus says to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. And so here, even though they recognize it's the Lord at this point, they don't really fully understand what's going on. And likely they're also still a little bit uneasy and find it strange that he's actually resurrected. And so they have questions. They want to ask, is it really you? Can this really be real? But on the other hand, their unease is such that they don't dare ask that question. And evidently Peter didn't even dare ask the question. He's usually the one who does. And so Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to him, and likewise the fish. So here in this image, this picture that Jesus is making for the disciples and then for the reader, it's another picture of an act of service that Jesus is doing for the disciples, similar to the foot washing. And so they're being provided by the Good Shepherd here, but they're also being called to participate in the ministry of the Good Shepherd by casting the net and bringing the fish to this meeting of fellowship around this fire. And this is the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And as I said, in this, we have the imagery of them bringing these fish around this coal of fires. And the last time we saw that would have been John 18:18. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself also. And that is where he's asked 3 times, wait, aren't you one of the disciples? And he denies it. And each time he gets more angry and more vehement with his response. And so here we have, there we go. Here we have in verse 15 through 19, Peter is now asked 3 questions by Jesus around this fire of coals. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he says to him, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. It's likely the reason the third time Peter was grieved is he got where this was going. He realized the last time, not that long ago, he had standing, warming himself after a cold, hard night around a fire of coals, that he had been asked the same question, basically, whether he was a disciple of Jesus 3 times, and each time he had denied that. And here, Jesus asks him this once, and he answers straightforward. Second time, same thing. Third time, Peter is grieved in his response because he realizes where this is going. But on the other hand, in doing this, each time, Jesus does not rebuke Peter. Instead, he commissions Peter to participate. And basically, there's an acknowledgement here, a restoration of Peter having those three denials, that now he's making three declarations of his love for Jesus. And in each one, Jesus is saying, okay, since you're saying that, you now need to act and participate on that. You're saying that, you need to act and participate on that. And so the theme throughout the Gospel of John, when somebody declares belief, they need to participate in that belief. And Jesus just illustrated that with a group of disciples with a catch of fish. Now he's focusing in on one disciple who really needs this, Peter. Now it's not that in some way Peter's call was extra special and he was being set up to be the chief shepherd or somehow the pope or something like that. It's very clear from Peter's words himself in 1 Peter, he didn't take the call to mean that. In 1 Peter 1 through 4, Peter writes, "The elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder," he's putting himself at the same level, "and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the crown of glory that does not fade away." Well, here Peter clearly got the call in that he went on to be a pastor in the early church. And not only that, in 1 Peter, he's basically writing down in different words the same thing that Jesus called him to do in John chapter 21, where Jesus is like, if you love me, feed my sheep. Now, he doesn't tell Peter to feed Peter's sheep. It's very clear the sheep are not Peter's. The sheep belong to the chief shepherd, the good shepherd. And in 1 Peter, Peter makes it very clear. He did not have illusions of grandeur, thinking he was somehow the chief shepherd or somehow was more chief over the other pastors he was writing to. He said he was a fellow under shepherd with them. He wasn't a hired worker who was going to abandon the sheep, and neither should they be a hired worker. And so in 1 Peter, he extends that same call that he was given from the chief shepherd, the good shepherd. Most assuredly, continue on verse 18, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And in that culture, it would have been very clear the statement, you will stretch out your hands, is a reference to crucifixion. And just in case a reader didn't pick up on that, verse 19, this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. So Jesus' emphasis here is, do you love me, Peter? If you do, follow me, feed my sheep. Participate. Do what you're called to do. Now, unfortunately, at this time, Peter doesn't quite get it, in that his response is to turn around in verse 20, saw the disciple who Jesus loved following, who also had leaned on his breast at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? Peter, seeing him, says to Jesus, but Lord, what about this man? Peter's just been told that he's going to be crucified. He is going to die a martyr's death because he's going to follow Jesus. And his initial response is kind of understandable. He looks around at the other disciples, picks out the beloved disciple, and says, like, what about this guy? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says to him, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Now, that you follow me wasn't specifically just to Peter. It was to all of the disciples there and all of the readers who believe that Jesus is the light of the world. But also with this is an emphasis that Peter is called to follow the Good Shepherd, not compare himself to the other sheep and the other sheep's calling. And that isn't just for Peter. If it was, it wouldn't have been recorded here. It's also for John. It's also for every believer since then. Peter, in this case, is called to be a pastor, and he was called to be an individual who some 3 decades after this would be crucified. And think about that. He served as a pastor who was persecuted and who was arrested multiple times. And every time he was arrested, he had to be thinking, is this the time that he's going to be crucified? And he continued on. Most people don't have that burden of knowing how they're going to die. He did. Peter was called to be a pastor to care for Jesus' sheep. He was not called to compare his ministry of what others were called to do. John was also called to be a pastor. John was also called to be an author of much of the New Testament. After Paul, John wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else. His calling was different. Here Jesus is saying, no, keep your eyes on the Good Shepherd, follow the Good Shepherd, don't compare yourself to the other sheep. One of the commentators pointed out that even secular therapists today show that habitual comparison to others leads to depression and disillusionment. And here it's a biblical concept also. Follow the Good Shepherd, don't be envious of others. Verse 23, then the saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die. But if I want that he remain till I come, what is it to you? So here we have the narrator stepping in and making a correction of theology. Evidently, this words that had been said to Peter had gotten spread through the early church. And there were some who thought it meant that John would not die and that Jesus would come back before John's death. And John realized, and God realized, that had to be corrected because that was wrong. That wasn't what Jesus said. That was a wrong interpretation. And it was important that that be corrected because if John died and Jesus hadn't come back, that would have been a blow to people's faith and would have been ammunition to those who opposed Christianity. And it wasn't what Jesus said. So here John is also calling the reader, you need to read and follow Jesus' words carefully. Don't make them out to be things he didn't say. Don't twist Jesus' words and take them out of context or take them to mean something different just because you want them to or just because you think they do. And so here he's stepping in as a narrator and corrects that. And then the book concludes with verses 24 and 25. This is a disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So he's basically signing this as a legal affidavit and saying that these things that are written were a true testimony. And that's right on the heels of him correcting a misunderstanding to show that truth is important here. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Some of the wording is similar to how John chapter 20 ended. In chapter 20, there was an emphasis on Thomas making a personal profession of faith, my Lord and my God, followed by the narrator stepping in and saying, truly, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciple, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so there's a call to personal belief. And then in verse 21, there's an emphasis on those who have responded to that call of belief should participate in that call. And here, the participation, though, it's emphasized, may be different. Peter is called to participate in a way that is different than how John participates. John's participation is writing these down and being a witness and a testimony. And so just as Peter is called to feed my sheep, John shows his purpose was to be a witness and a testimony and write these things down. But through this, it also illustrates that each believer who believes this is called to participate in some way. We're not going to turn there, but Paul expands on this in 1 Corinthians 12, where he talks about the body of Christ being one, but each part has a different role. That principle is in the Gospel of John here also. Jeff talked about a few weeks ago that in James, faith without works is dead. That's a principle from John also, in that those who believe need to participate, not out of obligation, but because out of privilege and out of calling, and because, as Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? If you do, you'll participate. And asked 3 times to emphasize this was important, that Peter individually participate, and that also that the reader participates. And we also have in verse 25, and there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they're written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books. And part of that is because after John died, Jesus continues in the world to do things through disciples, through the church, participating in his ministry. And those things John couldn't have written down because he was gone by then physically on earth. And that there were other disciples who were carrying that call on. And I went way over, sorry about that. So let's close quickly in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for these words and that we'd heed this call to participate in your words. In Jesus'